On March 4, 1844, 6 scholars from Charleston College assembled in strict secrecy at a private home on Meeting Street. What transpired behind those closed doors was never officially documented. Yet, scattered fragments of correspondence suggest that what they encountered that day shook the very core of their intellectual authority. The challenge did not come from a rival professor or a European savant, but from a 27-year-old enslaved man whose questions left them unable to defend the foundations of their beliefs. Within weeks, all written traces of the meeting vanished from the college's archives, and the man himself disappeared from plantation records as if he had never existed. The college's board of trustees convened an emergency session 3 days later, the minutes of which remain sealed to this day. What could an enslaved man have asked that so threatened the carefully constructed certainties of Charleston's elite? Before we continue with the story of what happened in that Charleston drawing room, I want to ask, have you ever wondered how far those in power will go to suppress knowledge that threatens their worldview? If you're listening from the South or anywhere in America, leave a comment with your state or city. Subscribe to Hidden Ledger because what you're about to hear challenges everything we thought we knew about intellectual resistance in antebellum America. The truth is, the questions asked that day weren't just clever. They exposed contradictions so deep that acknowledging them would have unraveled the entire philosophical justification for the system these men defended. Charleston, in 1844, was the intellectual heart of the South, a city that prided itself on its European refinement, transplanted to American soil. The College of Charleston, founded in 1770, produced some of the region's most influential lawyers, physicians, and theologians. Its faculty included men who had studied at Edinburgh, Cambridge, and Heidelberg, scholars whose treatises on natural philosophy, classical languages, and moral theory circulated throughout the Atlantic world. The city's elite moved through a world of rigid hierarchies and unchallenged assumptions. St. Michael's church bells marked the hours for both planters arriving in their carriages and enslaved people running errands for their owners. The Charleston Library Society's reading room buzzed with debates about agricultural innovation, railroad expansion, and the latest European philosophical trends, while the city's auction houses conducted their grim business just blocks away. Among the plantations in the surrounding low country, the Gadsden estate on the Ashley River represented old wealth and tradition. Colonel Marcus Gadsden maintained a reputation for discipline and order, running his rice plantation with military precision learned during his service in the War of 1812. His 300 acres of rice fields produced consistent yields, and his holdings included 47 enslaved people, whose labor sustained his family's position in Charleston society. The enslaved community on the Gadsden plantation developed its own hidden networks of knowledge and resistance. Information passed through songs, coded conversations, and stolen moments of literacy. Despite laws that made teaching enslaved people to read a crime, some had been literate before enslavement, passing fragments of knowledge through whispered lessons and memorized texts. Daniel arrived at the Gadsden plantation in 1832 as part of an estate settlement, purchased along with his mother from a failed tobacco operation in Virginia. The records listed him as 12 years old, valued at $400, with a note that he showed aptitude for house service. His mother, Bess, was assigned to the kitchen, where her skills with preserving and cooking had been noted by the previous owner. What the records could not capture was what Daniel carried in his mind. His previous owner, Dr. Ambrose Fletcher, a physician in Richmond, had maintained an extensive library and allowed Daniel's mother to clean his study. During those cleaning sessions, young Daniel discovered books. Dr. Fletcher, elderly and increasingly forgetful, sometimes left volumes open on his desk. Daniel would memorize pages during the brief moments he had access, storing words and concepts he couldn't yet fully understand. The Fletcher household was different from most. The elderly doctor, a widower whose children had moved north, maintained peculiar habits born from loneliness and absent-mindedness. He would read passages aloud to himself, working through difficult Latin texts or mathematical proofs, and sometimes Daniel, waiting silently in the corner to tend the fire or bring tea, would listen. The doctor never acknowledged that Daniel might be listening, might be comprehending, but he never stopped reading aloud either. When Daniel was 9, Dr. Fletcher received a visitor, a Quaker teacher from Pennsylvania, who spoke quietly but passionately about the sinfulness of slavery. Daniel, serving drinks in the study, heard every word of their debate. The Quaker argued that enslaved people possessed the same capacity for learning as anyone else, that the observed differences stemmed from denied opportunity, not natural limitation. Dr. Fletcher disagreed, but not violently. His disagreement was philosophical, thoughtful, the kind that acknowledged uncertainty. After the Quaker left, Dr. Fletcher sat in his study for a long time, then pulled down a volume of Epictetus. He read aloud, as was his habit, "No man is free who is not master of himself." Then he looked directly at Daniel for the first time in their years together and said, "I wonder what you make of that, boy." He didn't wait for an answer, but the question itself was revolutionary. It acknowledged that Daniel might make something of it at all. The journey from Richmond to Charleston after Dr. Fletcher's death was traumatic. The estate sale scattered everyone Daniel had known. His mother was fortunate. If fortune meant anything in such circumstances, they were purchased together. Many families were split, children torn from parents, spouses separated forever. Daniel watched these scenes unfold during the auction and understood with terrible clarity that all the philosophy he'd secretly learned couldn't protect against the fundamental violence of their situation. The Gadsden plantation represented a different kind of bondage than he'd known in Virginia. Colonel Gadsden ran his operation with military efficiency, viewing enslaved people as investments to be maintained for optimal productivity. There was less casual cruelty here than in some places, but also less accidental humanity. Everything was calculated, structured, designed to extract maximum labor while maintaining the value of the human property. By 14, Daniel could read English, Latin, and some Greek, though he kept this knowledge hidden. He learned early that intelligence in an enslaved person provoked suspicion and punishment. He watched, listened, and accumulated knowledge like a miser hoarding coins, knowing that one day this invisible wealth might serve a purpose he couldn't yet imagine. The learning hadn't come easily, without formal instruction. Daniel had to piece together grammar rules from observation, deduce pronunciation from context, and construct understanding through sheer force of pattern recognition. He would study the way Latin words declined, how Greek conjugations worked by comparing multiple texts and finding the common structures. It was like assembling a puzzle without knowing what the final picture should look like, working from fragments and inference. Mathematics had been particularly challenging without someone to explain the underlying logic. He found a volume of Euclid's Elements in the Colonel's library and worked through it proof by proof, sometimes spending weeks on a single proposition until the reasoning clicked into place. The beauty of mathematical logic was a revelation. Here was a form of thought that demanded absolute precision, where sloppy reasoning was immediately exposed, where truth could be demonstrated with certainty. During these years, Daniel developed techniques for hiding his knowledge. He maintained a careful blankness of expression, never showing recognition when educated visitors discussed topics he understood, never correcting errors he overheard in others' reasoning. He became expert at the performance of ignorance, understanding that survival depended on whites never suspecting the interior life that continued developing behind his carefully neutral mask. The enslaved community on the Gadsden plantation had its own complex dynamics. Some viewed Daniel's house position with suspicion, seeing house servants as collaborators too comfortable with proximity to white power. Others recognized the subtle ways he used his position to gather information useful to the broader community. Advanced warning of sales, knowledge of the colonel's moods and plans. Small acts of sabotage like accidentally leaving gates unlocked or tools misplaced to slow work without being traceable to anyone's intent. His mother worried constantly about his hidden learning. She'd seen enslaved people punished for far less than what Daniel was doing. In Virginia, she'd witnessed a man beaten nearly to death for being caught with a book, and another sold away from his family for teaching children their letters. The laws against literacy weren't casual prejudice. They represented systemic recognition that knowledge was power, and that power in the hands of enslaved people threatened the entire structure of bondage. "You think those books will set you free?" she asked him once late at night in the quiet of the kitchen house. "All they'll do is make you understand your chains better. Sometimes ignorance is mercy, Daniel." "Maybe," he replied, "but I'd rather understand my chains than pretend they don't exist. At least understanding gives you the possibility of finding the lock." The metaphor proved more literal than either of them realized at the time. Colonel Gadsden, unlike Dr. Fletcher, maintained no illusions about the intellectual capacity of enslaved people. He'd heard the emerging scientific theories that classified human beings into hierarchies of intelligence, theories conveniently confirming his economic interests. Several volumes in his own library argued that African-descended people lacked the mental architecture for abstract reasoning, a claim that provided comfortable justification for the system from which he profited. Daniel worked in the colonel's house, serving meals, maintaining the library, and attending to visitors. His demeanor suggested exactly what was expected: respectful silence, quick obedience, no hint of the interior life that continued growing behind carefully neutral expressions. He developed an extraordinary memory, the kind born from necessity when written notes might mean death. Every book spine in the library, every conversation overheard while refilling water glasses, every newspaper left on side tables, all became part of an education assembled in secret. The colonel's eldest son, Benjamin Gadsden, had recently returned from 3 years at the College of Charleston, filled with enthusiasm for the latest philosophical debates and scientific theories. He'd studied under Professor Nathaniel Hayworth, who taught moral philosophy and maintained that clear hierarchies in human society reflected divine ordering. Benjamin often held forth at dinner parties, repeating his professor's arguments about natural law and social order, while Daniel stood near the sideboard, refilling wine glasses and absorbing every word. The sequence of events that led to that March meeting began at a December dinner party at the Gadsden residence. Professor Howarth himself attended, along with several prominent Charleston physicians and 2 visiting scholars from Virginia. The conversation turned to education, specifically to a recent controversy at Yale regarding the admission of a student with radical abolitionist sympathies. The question, Professor Hayworth declared, isn't whether education should be available, but whether certain minds possess the fundamental capacity for higher reasoning. The Scottish philosophers have made this abundantly clear. Human intellects exist on a spectrum, and we do grave disservice when we attempt to elevate those naturally suited to labor into realms of abstract thought. Dr. William Pettigrew, a physician who'd published several papers on cranial measurements, nodded enthusiastically. "The anatomical evidence supports this entirely. I've personally examined dozens of skulls, and the measurements show consistent patterns. The frontal lobe development in the African race simply cannot support the kind of reasoning required for philosophical inquiry." Daniel, stand, ing motionless by the serving table, felt something shift inside him. He'd read these same theories in the books he'd secretly studied, had read the measurements, the classifications, the supposedly scientific proofs. He'd also read the Greek philosophers these men claimed to admire, had worked through Euclidean geometry using charcoal on boards when no one watched, had memorized passages from Newton and Locke and Bacon. More than that, he'd read accounts by African scholars and travelers that contradicted the European narratives these men took as gospel. He knew about the Kingdom of Mali, about Timbuktu's universities, about the complex political and philosophical traditions these supposed experts claimed didn't exist. The Europeans dismissed or ignored any evidence that contradicted their preferred conclusions, then pointed to the absence of evidence as proof of their claims. The intellectual dishonesty of it made Daniel's stomach turn. These weren't ignorant men making simple mistakes. They were educated scholars deliberately constructing elaborate frameworks of justification for economic exploitation. They knew how to reason. They demonstrated sophisticated logical thinking in other contexts. But when it came to race and slavery, they abandoned intellectual rigor in favor of conclusions that served their interests. Though, of course, one visitor added with a laugh, "The question is purely theoretical. They couldn't master such skills even if we tried to teach them. It would be like attempting to instruct a horse in mathematics." The casual dismissiveness of this comment crystallized Daniel's resolve. These men had constructed entire philosophical systems based on assumptions they'd never seriously tested. They claimed scientific certainty about questions they'd never genuinely investigated. They decided what the answer must be, then worked backward to create arguments supporting that predetermined conclusion. Daniel's hands remained steady as he poured more wine, but something had crystallized. For years, he'd kept his knowledge hidden, understanding instinctively that revealing it would bring danger. But these men weren't just defending a social system. They were claiming intellectual authority to declare certain forms of human intelligence impossible. They were making their certainty into scientific fact, building academic reputations on theories that would collapse under even basic scrutiny. In that moment, Daniel made a decision that would alter several lives irrevocably. He would find a way to pose questions that would force these scholars to confront what they refused to see. Not to prove himself to them, their opinion mattered nothing to his sense of his own humanity, but to expose the intellectual dishonesty that allowed them to sleep comfortably while profiting from human bondage. The opportunity came sooner than he anticipated. A week after the dinner party, Professor Howarth returned to the Gadsden residence to review Benjamin's paper. He arrived early, and Colonel Gadsden was still out inspecting the rice fields. Benjamin asked Daniel to show the professor to the library and bring refreshments. Left alone briefly in the library, Professor Howarth examined the bookshelves with evident approval. His eye fell on a volume of Plato's Republic, a recent translation from Greek. He pulled it from the shelf and was examining it when Daniel returned with tea. "A fine edition," the professor commented absently, more to himself than to Daniel, "though I suspect the colonel finds less use for it than for his agricultural texts. The Greeks understood natural hierarchies far better than our modern sentimentalists." Daniel set down the tea service. Every instinct of survival told him to remain silent, but the decision made the dinner party held firm. "Begging your pardon, sir," Daniel said, his voice carefully respectful, "but I've always wondered about the allegory of the cave in that very book. If the prisoners have lived their entire lives seeing only shadows, how could they recognize true forms when first shown them? Wouldn't the shadows be for them the only reality they could comprehend?" The professor's head turned slowly. His expression showed confusion, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. "What did you say?" "The cave allegory, sir. Plato suggests that seeing true forms is possible once one leaves the cave, but he doesn't address how a mind conditioned entirely by shadows could recognize truth when confronted with it. It seems to me there's an assumption in his reasoning that human minds possess some innate capacity to recognize truth regardless of conditioning. But if that's so, how can we claim that certain people are naturally incapable of philosophical understanding? Wouldn't Plato's own logic suggest that it's exposure and education, not inherent capacity, that determines philosophical ability? The room had gone very quiet. Professor Hayworth's face had lost its color. He stared at Daniel as if reassessing what stood before him, his academic training warring with deeply held assumptions about what should be possible. "You've read this book?" The professor's voice had a strange quality, not quite disbelief, but something close to it. "I've encountered many of the Colonel's books, sir, in the course of my duties." Benjamin entered at that moment, cheerful and oblivious to the tension. "Ah, Professor Hayworth, my apologies for keeping you waiting. I have my paper ready for your review." "Daniel, you may go." Daniel left, but he'd seen the professor's expression. The question had landed like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples outward. The evening. After Professor Hayworth's visit, Daniel understood he'd crossed a line from which there could be no return. He expected punishment, perhaps immediate and severe. Instead, something stranger occurred. Nothing happened. Days passed. Colonel Gadsden said nothing. Benjamin treated Daniel exactly as before. The household routine continued without disruption, but small signs suggested that something had shifted. Daniel noticed the colonel observing him during dinner service, his gaze lingering with an expression that mixed confusion and calculation. 2 weeks later, Daniel overheard a conversation between the colonel and his wife. He'd been cleaning the hallway outside the drawing room when their voices carried through the partially opened door. "Hayworth claims the boy quoted Plato at him," the colonel said, his tone skeptical. "He's convinced himself that he witnessed something remarkable." I told him it was likely something Daniel overheard Benjamin discussing, repeated back without true understanding. "Mimicry, nothing more." But Nathaniel described it as a question, not mere repetition, Mrs. Gadsden replied. He said it demonstrated understanding of the philosophical argument. Then Hayworth is a fool. Next, he'll be claiming that horses can debate theology because one whinnied at the right moment during Sunday service. Yet the colonel's dismissiveness didn't quite mask an undercurrent of uncertainty. The incident had disturbed the comfortable certainty of his worldview, created a small crack in the intellectual edifice that justified his entire way of life. For Daniel, the colonel's reaction clarified something crucial. It wasn't enough to simply demonstrate knowledge in a brief exchange. The comfortable explanation of mimicry allowed these men to dismiss anything that contradicted their assumptions. To truly challenge their certainty, he would need to demonstrate sustained reasoning, the kind that couldn't be explained away as parroting overheard conversations. He began planning carefully in the library. He had access to the colonel's extensive collection. He knew which books Benjamin studied at college, which philosophical questions occupied the attention of Charleston's intellectual class. He memorized arguments, but more importantly, he identified the contradictions and weak points in the reasoning that supposedly proved enslaved people incapable of higher thought. He prepared himself not just with knowledge, but with specific challenges designed to expose these fundamental weaknesses. In late January, Daniel encountered a traveling minister named Reverend Thomas Ashworth, visiting the Gadsden home. The Reverend had published a treatise arguing that slavery represented a divine institution ordained by Scripture and natural law. He'd brought copies of his book to present to the colonel. While serving dinner, Daniel overheard Reverend Ashworth defending his position. Scripture is explicit on this matter. The curse of Ham, the Apostle Paul's instructions to servants, the clear hierarchies established in both Old and New Testaments, all support the divine ordering of society as we see it. Later, while clearing dishes, Daniel spoke quietly. "Reverend, I wonder if I might ask a question about your interpretation." The minister looked up, surprised, but not immediately hostile. Religious men sometimes indulged questions from enslaved people, seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate piety. "If the curse of Ham justifies enslavement of his descendants," Daniel asked carefully, "how do we determine who those descendants are?" The Genesis account specifies that Ham's son Canaan was cursed, not Ham himself. Historically, Canaanites were associated with the people of the Levant, not Africa. The connection between Ham and African peoples seems to be a later interpretation, not a biblical one. On what textual basis do you make that connection? Reverend Ashworth's expression shifted from indulgence to weariness. The traditional understanding. "But tradition isn't the same as Scripture, sir. You argued that Scripture is explicit, yet the text itself never identifies Africans as Canaanites. It seems the explicitness you claim relies on adding interpretations that aren't present in the original text. How do we distinguish between what the Bible actually says and what we read into it based on our preferred conclusions?" The minister's face flushed. "Young man, you presume far too much in questioning scholarly interpretation of Scripture." "I'm not questioning your scholarship, sir. I'm asking about the logical foundation of the argument. If we claim biblical authority, shouldn't we be precise about what the Bible actually states versus what represents later interpretation?" Colonel Gadsden had been watching this exchange with growing alarm. "Daniel, that's enough. Return to the kitchen." As Daniel left, he heard Reverend Ashworth's agitated voice. "Marcus, where did that boy learn to argue textual interpretation? That wasn't simple curiosity. He was applying principles of biblical scholarship." The seed had been planted again, but Daniel knew his time was running short. Each demonstration of knowledge increased the danger. If he was going to make his challenge meaningful, it would need to be formal, undeniable, impossible to dismiss. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Professor Hayworth couldn't let go of his encounter in the Gadsden library. The question Daniel had posed nagged at him, not because he lacked an answer, but because the question itself revealed a level of comprehension that shouldn't exist. He spent weeks constructing explanations. The boy had overheard company conversations, had memorized phrases without understanding, had stumbled into a coherent question through pure chance. None of these explanations satisfied him. Hayworth prided himself on intellectual honesty, and something in Daniel's phrasing had demonstrated genuine engagement with Platonic philosophy. The question hadn't been a memorized recitation. It had identified a specific logical problem in Plato's allegory and connected it to contemporary debates about inherent versus acquired knowledge. In early February, Hayworth made a decision that would have profound consequences. He approached Colonel Gadsden with a proposal that mixed scientific curiosity with a desire to conclusively prove his theoretical positions. "Marcus, I want to conduct an experiment," Hayworth said during a private meeting in the colonel's study. "This situation with your house servant presents a unique opportunity. If he truly comprehends philosophical concepts, we should establish this definitively. If not, we can demonstrate that his apparent knowledge is mere mimicry, which would itself be valuable for my research on mental capacity." Colonel Gadsden frowned. "What exactly do you propose?" "Allow me to question him formally and thoroughly. I'll bring several colleagues, men whose scholarly credentials are beyond dispute. We'll examine him on philosophy, classical languages, mathematics, natural science. If he demonstrates genuine understanding, it becomes a remarkable case study. If he fails, as I expect, we'll have conclusive evidence that surface-level mimicry shouldn't be mistaken for true comprehension." The colonel considered this carefully. His initial instinct was refusal. The entire notion seemed bizarre, even dangerous. Yet Hayworth's framing was persuasive. The professor wasn't suggesting that Daniel might be intelligent. He was proposing to definitively prove the limitations the colonel already believed existed. And if he does demonstrate understanding, the colonel asked carefully. Hayworth smiled confidently. Then we'll have identified a profound anomaly worthy of serious study, though I suspect we'll simply document an interesting case of highly developed mimicry. Either outcome advances our understanding of mental capacity and racial characteristics. What Hayworth didn't fully articulate, perhaps didn't fully acknowledge to himself, was his deeper motivation. A small part of him wondered if his entire philosophical framework might be wrong. If one enslaved person could truly reason abstractly, what did that mean for all the theories he'd built his reputation upon? He needed to know definitively. The colonel agreed, but with strict conditions. The examination would be private, conducted in a controlled setting, and no written records would be kept that might circulate publicly. Whatever they discovered would inform future research, but wouldn't become a political weapon for abolitionists. When Hayworth presented this proposal to his faculty colleagues, reactions were mixed. Professor Edmund Cartwright, who taught classical languages, expressed skepticism. "This seems an odd use of our time, Nathaniel. What exactly do you hope to prove? That intelligence is not randomly distributed without regard to race and station?" Hayworth replied, "Or if I'm wrong, to learn something that challenges our current understanding. Isn't that what scholarship demands, testing our assumptions against evidence?" Professor James Vernon, who taught natural philosophy and mathematics, showed more interest. "I've long wondered if apparent racial differences in intelligence might be tested empirically rather than simply assumed, though I suspect we'll find exactly what we expect: surface-level learning without genuine comprehension." The group grew to alongside Hayworth, Cartwright, and Vernon. They included Dr. William Pettigrew, the physician who'd spoken at the dinner party, Reverend Thomas Ashworth, whose ego still smarted from his theological debate, and Professor Henry Jameson, who taught ethics and had recently published a defense of natural social hierarchies. Daniel learned of the proposed examination through kitchen gossip. One of the other house servants had overheard the colonel discussing it with his wife. The news spread through the enslaved community with the speed of wildfire. "They're planning to test you," his mother told him one evening in the kitchen house, her voice tight with fear. "Daniel, this is dangerous. Whatever you've been doing, you need to stop. Play dumb. Tell them you don't understand their questions. They're not going to free you for being smart. They're going to punish you for it." Daniel had been expecting this moment since that first question in the library. "Mama, they've already decided what I am. They've built entire systems of thought to justify treating people like property. Maybe it's time someone forced them to question those certainties. And what happens to you after? You think the colonel will keep you here after you embarrass his scholar friends? You'll be sold downriver, Daniel. You'll end up cutting cane in Louisiana, dying from malaria before you're 30. Is that worth proving a point to men who won't change their minds anyway?" She was right. The rational choice was to feign ignorance, to survive. But Daniel had spent years hiding, had watched countless people broken by a system that insisted their minds were inferior. If he could force even one of these men to question their certainties, perhaps it would matter. "Maybe I can't change how they see me," Daniel said quietly. "But I can change how they see themselves. I can make them uncomfortable with tea. Their own logic. That's something." The examination was scheduled for March 4th, to be held at the home of Professor Hayworth's brother-in-law, a wealthy merchant with a spacious drawing room suitable for such an unusual event. The location was chosen specifically to maintain privacy. Not the college campus where students might observe, but a private residence where discretion could be maintained. As the date approached, Daniel prepared differently than the professors likely imagined. He wasn't cramming knowledge or memorizing facts. Instead, he was preparing questions, specific, targeted inquiries designed to expose the logical contradictions in the philosophical framework these men defended. The morning of March 4th dawned clear and unseasonably warm for early spring. Daniel rode to the examination in the colonel's carriage, sitting in the servants' area, while Colonel Gadsden reviewed papers inside. The colonel had said little about what would happen, had given no instructions beyond answer their questions honestly. The residence on Meeting Street belonged to Harrison Whitfield, a cotton merchant who'd married Professor Hayworth's younger sister. The drawing room had been arranged like a formal academic examination, with a single chair positioned before a semicircle of seats where the 6 scholars would sit. A small table held books, papers, and writing implements, evidence that the professors had prepared specific tests. The 6 men assembled, their expressions ranging from scientific curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Reverend Ashworth, in particular, seemed eager to avenge his earlier embarrassment. Dr. Pettigrew had brought calipers and a notebook, apparently intending to take measurements to correlate with whatever intellectual capacity they discovered. Professor Hayworth began with a preamble that revealed both his intentions and his anxieties. "We're gathered today for an unusual examination. Our subject is a house servant named Daniel, property of Colonel Marcus Gadsden, who has demonstrated what appears to be remarkable aptitude for learning. Our purpose is to determine whether this apparent aptitude represents genuine comprehension, or, as we suspect, sophisticated mimicry without true understanding. We'll proceed systematically through various areas of knowledge. Daniel, you may sit." Daniel took the indicated chair. He maintained the demeanor expected of him, respectful, deferential, eyes appropriately downcast when not directly addressed. "Let them believe they controlled this encounter." Professor Cartwright, the classicist, began. He opened a Greek text, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and pointed to a passage. "Can you read this?" Daniel scanned the Greek text. "Yes, sir. Every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. And for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim." "It's the opening of the Nicomachean Ethics." Cartwright's eyebrows rose. "You recognize the text. Can you translate the next paragraph?" Daniel did so, accurately rendering Aristotle's Greek into clear English. The professors exchanged glances. Cartwright continued, selecting increasingly difficult passages, including some with archaic vocabulary and complex grammatical constructions. Daniel handled each one. "Latin?" Cartwright asked, his voice showing the first hints of uncertainty. They moved through Cicero, Virgil, and Seneca. Daniel's translations were accurate, his grasp of grammar impeccable. More than that, he could discuss the texts, their historical context, their philosophical significance, their influence on later thinkers. Professor Vernon took over, shifting to mathematics. He began with simple arithmetic problems that Daniel solved. Ed instantly, then algebra, geometry, basic calculus. Vernon's questions grew more complex, the kind of problems given to advanced students. Daniel worked through them methodically, sometimes asking for paper to show his reasoning. "Where did you learn calculus?" Vernon asked finally, his scientific detachment cracking slightly. "From the colonel's copy of Newton's Principia, sir. It took considerable time to work through without instruction, but the logical progression of the proofs is clear once you understand the fundamental principles." The room had grown very quiet. These weren't parlor tricks or memorized recitations. Daniel was demonstrating sustained reasoning across multiple domains of knowledge, showing not just retention, but comprehension and synthesis. Dr. Pettigrew, looking unsettled, tried a different approach. "Perhaps you've memorized a great deal," he said, his tone defensive. "But memorization isn't the same as original thought. Can you formulate your own arguments?" "I can try, sir. What subject would you like me to address?" Pettigrew hesitated, then said, "Very well. Defend the position that all humans possess equal capacity for reason." The room's atmosphere changed. They'd moved from testing knowledge to testing reasoning, and the subject was the very question at the heart of their gathering. Daniel had been waiting for this moment. "I'd prefer not to defend that position, sir." Hayworth leaned forward. "Why not?" "Because it's not the interesting philosophical question, sir. The more significant question is why some men work so hard to prove it false. Just when the examination seemed to be a simple test of knowledge, Daniel's response revealed he understood the deeper game being played. If you're finding this story compelling, share it with someone who appreciates complex history. Subscribe to Hidden Ledger for more stories that challenge what you think you know about the past. Let's continue with what happened when Daniel turned the tables on his examiners. The professors shifted uncomfortably. Daniel continued, his voice respectful but his logic sharp as broken glass. "Consider the structure of the argument, that certain races possess inferior mental capacity," he said. "It requires us to believe several things simultaneously. First, that these differences are so obvious and natural that they justify an entire social and economic system. Yet, second, that maintaining this system requires elaborate laws, constant surveillance, severe punishment for education, and extensive philosophical justification. If the differences were truly natural and obvious, why would such enforcement be necessary?" "You're confusing social order with natural capacity," Professor Jameson interjected. "Am I, sir? Let me pose a question. Imagine we took an infant from each race, raised them identically, same nutrition, same education, same opportunities. Would you be willing to stake your philosophical position on the outcome of such an experiment?" "That's absurd," Reverend Ashworth said. "The experiment is impossible." "Exactly, sir. It's impossible to conduct, because society won't permit it. We can't test whether racial differences in achievement are natural or environmental because we systematically prevent the conditions that would allow such a test. Then we point to the results of that systematic prevention as proof of natural differences. It's circular reasoning." Professor Hayworth had gone pale. "You're suggesting that our entire understanding of racial hierarchies is based on circular logic. I'm suggesting that the evidence you point to as proof might be an artifact of the system itself, rather than justification for it. Consider, if you prevent people from learning to read, then point to their elite racy as proof they cannot learn. You've created a logical loop that proves nothing except your own willingness to mistake effects for causes." The examination had moved far beyond its intended scope. What had begun as a test of knowledge had become something more dangerous, a challenge to the philosophical foundations the professors had built their careers upon. Professor Vernon tried to regain control of the discussion. "You're clever with words," he said, "but you're ignoring the anatomical evidence. Dr. Pettigrew's measurements show clear differences in cranial capacity between races." Daniel turned to Dr. Pettigrew. "Sir, I have questions about your methodology. Have you controlled for variables such as childhood nutrition, which affects skull development? Have you measured skulls from people of African descent who've had access to adequate food and health care from birth? Or have you primarily measured people subjected to the physical stress of forced labor and inadequate nutrition, then attributed the results to race rather than circumstance?" Pettigrew's face flushed. "The measurements are consistent across populations." "Consistent, yes, but correlation isn't causation. Surely you learned that principle in your medical training. If every African-descended person in your study has experienced similar deprivations, then consistent measurements might indicate the effects of those deprivations rather than inherent racial characteristics. Have you measured wealthy Africans, African nobility, or only enslaved people and their descendants?" The doctor had no answer. The truth was his measurements had been taken almost exclusively from enslaved people and free blacks living in poverty. He'd never considered that the conditions of their lives might affect the physical development he measured. Reverend Ashworth tried a different tack. Your facility with argument doesn't change divine law. Scripture ordains the social order we see. Then let me ask about divine law, Reverend. If God created all humans in his image, as Genesis states, how can some bear that image more fully than others? Either we all equally reflect divine creation, or Genesis is false. You can't claim biblical authority for racial hierarchy without contradicting the Bible's foundational claim about human nature. The curse of Ham. We've discussed this, sir. The text doesn't support your interpretation. You're reading your preferred conclusion into ambiguous scripture, then claiming divine authority for that conclusion. That's not biblical interpretation. It's using the Bible as a prop for positions you've already decided to hold. The room erupted into heated argument. The professors weren't debating Daniel anymore. They were debating each other, their certainties cracking under the pressure of questions they'd never seriously considered. Professor Haworth, who'd initiated this entire examination, sat silent. He was experiencing a moment of genuine intellectual crisis. Every question Daniel posed exposed assumptions Haworth had never examined. The logical framework he'd built his career upon was revealing itself as exactly what Daniel suggested: a sophisticated rationalization for economic interests, dressed in philosophical language, but lacking rigorous logical foundation. Professor Jameson, perhaps sensing Haworth's crisis, attempted to end the examination. This has gone far enough. We came to test knowledge, not to be subjected to sophistry. Is it sophistry to ask for logical consistency? Daniel asked quietly. You teach ethics, Professor Jameson. I've read your published work on natural law and moral philosophy. You argue that ethics must be grounded in reason, and that examining our assumptions is the foundation of philosophical inquiry. I'm simply asking you to apply those principles to your own assumptions about race and human capacity. The social consequences of questioning these foundations would be catastrophic, Jameson replied, his voice strained. For whom, sir? Not for those already experiencing catastrophe as the objects of this system. You mean the consequences would be uncomfortable for those who benefit from current arrangements? But since when is avoiding discomfort an adequate reason to abandon logical rigor and intellectual honesty? The examination had collapsed into chaos. Some professors were shouting at each other. Dr. Pettigrew had gathered his papers and was preparing to leave. Reverend Ashworth's face had gone red with anger, though whether at Daniel or his colleagues was unclear. Colonel Gadsden, who'd been observing from the edge of the room, finally intervened. Gentlemen, I believe we've concluded our examination. Professor Haworth found his voice. Marcus, I must speak with you privately. They withdrew to an adjacent room along with the other professors. Daniel remained in the drawing room, uncertain what would happen next. Through the closed door he could hear raised voices, though not specific words. The meeting lasted nearly an hour. When they emerged, the professors' expressions ranged from troubled to furious. Professor Haworth approached Daniel directly. You've demonstrated remarkable learning, he said carefully, but you must understand the danger of what you've done today. Knowledge without proper context, without guidance, can be destructive. These questions you've posed, they can't lead anywhere productive. With respect, sir, they've led to this moment. 6 educated men confronted with questions they couldn't satisfactorily answer. Isn't that where all genuine philosophy begins? With questions that challenge comfortable certainties. Haworth had no response. He turned to Colonel Gadsden. We should discuss this further privately at a later date. The aftermath of that March 4th examination moved swiftly and decisively, though the full scope of what happened would only become clear years later through fragmentary evidence. Within 3 days, the College of Charleston's Board of Trustees held an emergency session. The official minutes recorded only that certain matters regarding faculty research required immediate attention. The substance of their discussion remained unrecorded, but the outcome was clear. Any written accounts of the examination were to be collected and secured, and the participating professors were strongly encouraged to refrain from discussing the event publicly. Professor Hayworth, whose intellectual crisis had been visible to everyone present, took a sudden sabbatical. He withdrew from teaching for the remainder of the academic year, claiming health concerns. His personal correspondence from this period, preserved in family papers, reveals a man wrestling with profound doubt about positions he'd previously held with certainty. In a letter to his brother, Hayworth wrote, "I've encountered something that challenges every assumption upon which I've built my scholarly work. I cannot in good conscience continue teaching ideas I now suspect are elaborate justifications for economic exploitation rather than philosophical truth. Yet acknowledging this publicly would destroy my career and undermine the very foundations of our society. I am trapped between intellectual honesty and practical necessity." The other professors responded in various ways. Dr. Pettigrew doubled down, publishing a paper later that year, arguing even more vehemently for racial hierarchies based on anatomical measurements, though colleagues noted a defensive quality to his reasoning that hadn't been present in E.A. Relier work. Reverend Ashworth left Charleston entirely, accepting a position at a small seminary in Georgia. Professor Jameson became noticeably less certain in his lectures on ethics, occasionally posing questions to students that seemed designed to make them uncomfortable with easy certainties. As for Daniel, his fate unfolded exactly as his mother had feared. Colonel Gadsden, faced with an enslaved person who'd embarrassed his scholarly friends and potentially undermined the ideological foundations of the system from which he profited, made a swift decision. Within 2 weeks of the examination, Daniel was sold. The transaction was handled quietly through a slave trader named Cyrus Hammond, who specialized in difficult cases, enslaved people who'd caused problems for their owners and needed to disappear from local communities. The records show that Daniel was purchased by a buyer from Louisiana, destined for a sugar plantation where life expectancy rarely exceeded 10 years. The night before his departure, Daniel's mother came to the locked shed where he was being held. She'd bribed one of the overseers to allow a brief visit. "You were right about everything you said," she told him, tears streaming down her face. "But you were also wrong about one thing. You thought forcing them to question their certainties would matter. They'll forget this in a few months, Daniel. They'll find new arguments, new justifications. Meanwhile, you'll be gone." Daniel nodded slowly. "Maybe. But Professor Hayworth won't forget. He wrote most of the state's educational policy. If he spends the rest of his life doubting whether he was right, that might change something. Even if it's small, even if I never see it. And if it doesn't, then at least I didn't live my entire life pretending to be what they said I was. That has to count for something." The historical record loses track of Daniel after his sale. Louisiana plantation records from that period are incomplete, and the mortality rate for enslaved people on sugar plantations was so high that detailed records of individual deaths weren't consistently maintained. Whether he survived the brutal conditions, whether he found ways to continue learning and questioning, or whether the system finally broke him, none of this appears in surviving documents. What remains is a peculiar gap in Charleston's academic history. The College of Charleston's archives contain a mysterious absence where records from early 1844 should exist. Several of Professor Hayworth's lectures from that period are missing, though they're referenced in student notes. The private papers of multiple faculty members show signs of careful editing, with pages removed or passages heavily redacted. The professors involved never publicly discussed the examination, but private correspondence suggests it haunted several of them for years. Professor Jameson, in a letter to a colleague in 1852, alluded to an incident in my earlier career that convinced me we don't question our foundational assumptions as rigorously as we should. Professor Vernon mentioned in his diary the day our certainties met their match in the most unexpected source. The most significant impact may have been on Professor Hayworth. Though he returned to teaching after his sabbatical, colleagues noted changes in his approach. His lectures grew less dogmatic, more likely to present opposing viewpoints without immediate dismissal. In 1848, he quietly revised some of his published work, softening claims about racial hierarchies and acknowledging the circularity of certain arguments. These revisions were subtle enough not to damage his reputation, but present enough that later scholars noticed the shift. What happened in that Charlist on drawing room was intended to prove the certainties of educated men and the limitations of those they claimed were naturally inferior. Instead, it revealed something more troubling, that supposedly rigorous philosophical frameworks often amount to sophisticated rationalizations for systems of exploitation, and that challenging those frameworks requires more courage than most possess. The questions Daniel posed that day weren't answered. They couldn't be answered without dismantling the entire ideological structure that justified human bondage. So instead, the questions themselves were suppressed, the questioner removed, and the scholars who'd been challenged were left to live with the uncomfortable knowledge that their certainties weren't as solid as they'd believed. The examination of March 4, 1844, stands as testament to the power of questions that expose foundational contradictions. It demonstrates that intelligence and education aren't the same as wisdom and moral courage, and that sometimes the most important philosophical challenges come from those whom society has declared incapable of philosophical thought. What do you think really happened to Daniel after his sail to Louisiana? Could someone with his intelligence have found ways to survive and resist even in the brutal conditions of a sugar plantation? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story gave you insight into the hidden intellectual resistance that occurred within slavery, share this video with others who appreciate complex history. Subscribe to Hidden Ledger and hit the notification bell. We bring you the documented stories that history books often overlook. See you in the next video.